What do you believe right now that's making you feel this way? And when you analyse it, you realise how irrational you can be at times.
Every single one of our major customers and minor customers all shut their doors overnight.
It's not sales per se, but the outcome of it is because people get to know you, they get to see you.
But, you know, what's the culture like at the business? What do we stand for, the values?
I've got to tick that box on my personal development program I don't really want to be here.
Scaling up a business isn't easy. If it were, we wouldn't have less than 4% of businesses scaling beyond 10 employees or around £1 million turnover level, and less than 1% beyond 50 employees. But the contribution that we make as owner-managers to our economies is immense and should never be underestimated, yet it can be a tough gig for all of us at times, and only other business owners truly understand the challenges that we face. And through ScaleUp Radio, we aim to help make things a little easier. We interview guests who have been where you are now and may have faced some of the challenges that you are facing. And they offer their thoughts and advice on what has worked for them, as well as what didn't. And we've also combined many of the lessons from these interviews and also through working with hundreds of owner managers over the last 10 years or so into a practical scale-up handbook that we've called the Entrepreneurial Scale-Up System, or ESUS. And it's for owner managers like you and me as we navigate our own scale-up journey. And you can order a copy through your favourite online book retailer or by going to all the W's, esusgroup.co.uk, www.esusgroup.co.uk. Welcome to another fascinating episode of ScaleUp Radio. This time I talk with Adrian Burden, who is the co-founder of Blockmark Technologies. And this is someone who has been through the whole journey. He's done that complete journey from startup in the technical space, from raising finance through building and scaling his business, and then eventually having a successful exit. He's also written a book called Start to Exit, so he knows what he's talking about. And now he's building a business based around digital certificates, and we skirt around things like blockchain and NFTs, or non fungible tokens, for those of you that don't know, and we skirt around those things. But as always, it's not about the technology, it's about the business and the lessons that we can learn about building and scaling our businesses. And there is so much to take away from this episode. So I'm not going to spoil it anymore. I'm just going to suggest that we go across and listen to Adrian Burden and the rest of his story. Welcome to another episode of ScaleUp Radio. I'm here with Adrian Burden, who is the co-founder of Blockmark Technologies. So, Adrian, welcome to ScaleUp Radio.
Kevin, thank you very much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. I'm really looking forward to finding out more about what you do. I suspect I might end up being a little bit found wanting for my technical knowledge from what I can see of your background. So, Blockmark Technologies, what's that all about?
Yeah, well, that's actually a software company that co-founder Tom Alcott and myself put together actually about 5 years ago. We were exploring blockchain space, and we felt that there was something in it from our backgrounds. We were quite interested in it. And then over the years, we've kind of developed some blockchain-based technology, some software services off the back of it. And it's been a little bit of a meandering journey. We've gone down a few dead ends, but it's been quite fascinating because it is quite cutting edge. And people probably will have heard about non fungible tokens and cryptocurrencies and so on. So we were exploring all of that, as well as actually trying to build a business out of it. So we were fascinated by the technology.
So right at that cutting edge. So what are you trying to achieve with Blockmark Technologies?
Well, originally, the idea was to use the blockchain as a way of tracking the pedigree of goods and certification and so forth. I have a background in anti-counterfeiting originally. Tom actually had some experience importing food produce into the UK, particularly pepper. He started Peppermongers. And we were both acutely aware that there's a problem of proving things are genuine, tracking things in the supply chain and so forth. And blockchain is one of these technologies that people talk a lot about potentially solving some of these issues. It's pretty complicated, actually. It isn't the silver bullet, but it was fascinating enough for us to look into. So, yeah, we started exploring the blockchain side of things. And then over time, we've kind of worked out some of the elements that are useful. We did a couple of non fungible token projects, which I can explain a little bit more about later because they're quite fascinating.
Yeah, I think we'll probably have to explain what non-fungible tokens mean, because I've got a very, very rough idea, but I can't say I can express the detail. So.
No, well, when we were first doing those, nobody had any idea about them. And of course, they've become quite popular in the news now. People refer to NFTs quite frequently. So it's suddenly become popular. So that was an interesting area, which we're still working on. But one of the things we wanted to do with the software was develop a certification platform. We realized that the issuing of certificates, the receiving of certificates, and the all-important inspection of certificates — there's no point having a certificate unless you can check it's genuine — was actually quite problematic. There aren't very many providers out there that provide a seamless solution for this. And actually, we kind of identified a market need for that. And so we've been building out that platform. And that has some blockchain elements in it, although you don't need a blockchain. You can use a regular database really for that. And that's really what I'm spending a lot of my time on now. So about 80% of my time is spent trying to grow this business, get more customers on board.
So when you say for these certificates, what kind of certificates then would you be thinking of? Yeah,
so actually any kind of certificate, of course, in the end. If you think about it, a certificate traditionally is a piece of paper. Nowadays, maybe a PDF showing that you've been accredited to something, you're a member of something, your business might be accredited, like an accountancy business, ISO standard, etc. So certificates are actually, if you take a step back, floating around everywhere. They're quite crucial for businesses to show that they've reached certain levels. And they get issued to people, they get issued to organizations, and actually to objects like cars, MOT certificates. So with that in mind, we built a platform that could cope with all of that. But at the moment, we are issuing certificates mainly to businesses and organizations. And one of our biggest customers that we can talk about is IASME, who are also based here in Malvern. And they manage the Cyber Essentials certification scheme, amongst others. And so the Cyber Essentials that people will be getting around the UK is coming off our platform. And these are basically digital certificates to show that organizations or whatever have attained, in this case, Cyber Essentials or other certification levels. And they can display the certificate, obviously, on their website. They can send it to people. But because it's digital and it's not a piece of paper that can get lost or whatever, it means that you come back to effectively our platform to check that it was the organization that says has issued it, and so forth. So it provides a kind of an audit trail for certificates and allows you to organize them. So as they start to expire, you can renew them. If you're the issuer, you can revoke or suspend them if for some reason the entity that's received the certificate is no longer valid. And that's the sort of control that you don't have over a paper certificate or a PDF certificate that's just emailed out.
Right. So the originator, the people that originally issued the certificate, then have also got access to this, so that it's up to date, and you're not just a standalone database that somebody could adjust. No,
exactly. So it's a cloud-based platform. Over the last few years, we've spent a lot of time with in-house coders working the whole thing out from the ground up in terms of what's required, working closely with these key customers. And putting together all the logic that needs to be there to allow certificates to be issued and checked and so forth. And what's been quite fascinating about it is, when we had the original idea, we thought, oh, well, this is fairly simple. It hasn't necessarily been done, but, it is just a database, a bit of software. But actually, once you start writing it and getting it used and customers start getting involved, it becomes so complicated. And we have lots and lots of interesting new features that we want to add. We're getting customer feedback all the time. And I think what's interesting now is, having done this for a couple of years intensely, we're at a point where we can see it really ticking up. We're getting a lot of certificates issued. we're starting to see certificates from multiple players going to the same organization, so they can start to organize their certificates in one place. And that's the whole key, really, to kind of have that critical mass and make it a sort of the one-stop platform where you will go to manage this part.
Yes, and that's often the challenge with all sorts of areas like this, isn't it? Where you've always got two sides to the market, but you've got to get to a critical mass on both sides before it's
exactly. Yeah, it's a classic two-sided issue. You need lots of issuers issuing certificates. You need lots of recipients, and you need there to be enough of both to make it worthwhile for them to want to use the system. So with that in mind, I mean, because we've started with some cybersecurity certificates, we can see that as an area where we can get a bit of critical mass first. So there are other organizations issuing sort of information assurance, cybersecurity, and that extends to health and safety as well. You know, that's all that kind of duty of care certification. So that's our strategy, really, to build out along those rather than trying to go for lots and lots of different types of certificates all at once, because we could, of course, tackle academia issuing A-levels and degree certificates, but there are pros and cons.
Yes.
To be honest, we want certificates that expire. So a birth certificate is not a good example because they go on forever.
Yeah.
So MOTs are a good example. They're renewed every year for cars, and if you've got that kind of throughput,
steer clear of birth and death certificates.
Yeah. And actually, things like A-level certificates, once you've got an A-level certificate or an O-level or GCSE or whatever, they go on in perpetuity. So although our system will handle all of that, from a business perspective, that's not necessarily the ones to go for.
So how does the business model work?
Yeah, well, it's still evolving. We have a very simple model at the moment, which is basically £1 per certificate per year. That's how we've kind of couched it. So, but you can see what that basically says is that every time a certificate is issued, there's a fee. But we've been looking at different things in terms of hosting, adding extra features. There's lots of other things you can add that bring value around, for example, how often certificates are looked at and inspected and checked. That kind of data is important because it gives you a feel for how interested customers or suppliers are in your certification. It's obviously really important for the issuers of schemes to know how well received and checked certificates are. So that data element can also add value. And we can consider sort of freemium models where, as you want more data, you can subscribe to extra features.
Very good. So who else? What's the alternatives? If I want to have my certificates managed, what would my alternatives be?
Well, there are a couple of competitors, which I'm not going to mention, but just to say that there are others that issue badges and sort of certificate things digitally.
Yeah,
I think what's a bit different is how we've gone about it in terms of building it for all three parts of the ecosystem. So if you issue, receive, or inspect a certificate, those three sort of functions are all built into what we've put together. So when you're using our platform, you can be all three. You can issue certificates to some clients, but you may also receive certificates and be inspecting others as you do your due diligence. So that's something we wanted to build in from the beginning. And that gives it a bit more robustness. But actually, there aren't really very many competitors out there offering this kind of thing. And I think that's because traditionally certificates are a sort of an old world thing. You expect to get parchment with your wax seal on the bottom, put it on the wall. But, things are moving on. People need to check that these things are genuine. People are expecting things to be sent and shown on screens and so forth. And actually, I think, interestingly, the COVID pandemic helped with all of this because we've become very used to showing people certificates being, vaccinated or having no COVID symptoms or whatever on our mobile phone. Yeah. And that's made people think, really, these kinds of credentials should be digital.
Yes, that's true. Whereas I guess probably up to that point, it was a lot of it was about the hard copy, wasn't it?
Yeah, which get lost, get torn. And actually to replace them is problematic. You've got to go back to the originator and ask for the paper copy to re-sent out.
Very good. So, I mean, it's fascinating stuff. What got you into this in the first place?
Yeah. So I guess the thing was, I was interested in tech and software anyway. I always have been in that area. And previously I worked and co-founded a company on anti-counterfeiting quite a few years ago now. And that was a kind of certification system. But what we did there is we had a materials-based technology which would create fingerprints, random fingerprints that you could put on products. So just like you and I have a fingerprint on the end of our finger, and we use that to go through immigration and identify ourselves, we came up with this technology that you could create a random fingerprint, very difficult, if not impossible, to counterfeit, that could be attached to a product, linked to a database, and could show that it was the genuine product because the fingerprint was attached at the point of manufacture, for example.
Yeah.
And we developed that, and that was quite a complicated system. It involved the database, it involved readers, as well as the labels and the technology that we put onto the product. And it was successful in that we grew the business and we exited it, and it went to a bigger company that took it into some larger sectors, particularly the pharmaceutical area, pharmaceutical packaging.
Okay. Yeah.
And because of that background in anti-counterfeiting and so forth, I'd always been interested in how you make sure things are secure and you make your supply chain robust and so forth. And as I mentioned earlier, because blockchain was this emerging tech, it occurred to me that actually maybe the blockchain could make this whole thing easier again. So that's really why we came back around to certificates and blockchain. Now, interestingly, you don't need to use the blockchain for what I've described, but it has some advantages. So for those that don't know about blockchains, basically it's a distributed ledger. And what we mean by that is a record that's spread around the world in multiple copies, and it's most famously used for cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. And actually it's really good for that application, because what it does is it solves the double spend problem for digital money. It means that if I send you some Bitcoin, I can't send the same Bitcoin to someone else, and the ledger keeps track of all of that. And people have said, oh, great, this ledger can be used for all sorts of things. And sometimes, it can, having this distributed sort of font of knowledge is useful, but it can also be overkill. It can be slow and so forth. But it did occur to us that maybe this distributed ledger could be a good record for certification.
Yeah.
And that's because you don't have to rely on us or the certification body to be telling the truth. The record is out there and can be effectively encrypted or encoded, so it can't be tampered with, multiple copies, and the point at which it was issued, that's kind of notarized at a point in time and can be checked. So that's where we were looking at it from. And we've added those kind of features to what we're doing. But we learned quite quickly, I think, that when you're launching a new product, don't make it overcomplicated. Come up with something that, we talk about the minimum viable product, the MVP, but something that a customer understands and wants to use. And we found that in the case of certification, customers we're talking to were like, well, actually, we don't really need all this blockchain. In fact, we're afraid of it. We don't understand how it works. We hear in the press about dark money and cryptocurrency. We're not sure we want to be associated with that. And so that was a classic example of, technology push as opposed to market pull, where we think it's great because it's tech. It isn't necessarily what the customer needs. It's overkill, and actually take a step back and deliver a solution that's a bit easier to understand.
Very good. So I'd be really keen to explore your lessons, because you've been through this is you mentioned before that with the counterfeiting company that you've been through from startup through to a successful exit, and you're now starting doing again. You're 4 or 5 years into into this one. So and I know you've written a book as well on called Start to Exit. So I'd love to get your views. So for our listeners, as to what you think particularly within the technology space that you've been in, what are some of the key things we need to be thinking about to have a successful start to exit? You talk about, I think, building value within there. So how do you make sure you're creating value? Love to explore your thoughts. So where do we start? What's the
well, exactly. So what I actually always say to people that sort of ask me about this is, when you're starting the business, think about the exit right at the start. And that's because obviously when you start a business, that's probably the last thing you want to consider is, the exit and leaving it. But if you plan it from the beginning, it makes, I think, a whole lot easier. Because anybody that has gone through the sale of a business will know that it's one of the most difficult things to sell. Somebody once told me that the best salesman is the one that actually sells the business, not the products within it. So it's not easy, but it's not easy because when people want to buy a business, they want to make sure they're buying something that's viable, that's well run, that hasn't got lots of skeletons in the closet. And so by thinking about your exit from the beginning, you can get yourself organized, basically, to make sure that everything's in place to facilitate that as you move through it. And I think also it's really helpful from a succession planning point of view anyway. When you start in a business, if you're thinking about the exit, even if it's longer term, you're actually thinking about who else can run the business alongside me or alongside the founding team. Things happen that can cause disruption. So having that mitigation of risk is helpful as well. In terms of tech, I think it's more complicated in general. The tech element adds that extra dimension of risk. You don't know that things are going to work until you've tested them, both got them to work in the field, but also got them to work with customers. So that adds extra anxiety, the whole process. But it adds a lot of value later. And certainly if you can protect your technology with know-how, patents, other intellectual property as you go, that builds the value that you're able to sell in the business later as well. So keep an eye on that, I would say. And the main thing is try and stay organized as you go. So in the book that you mentioned, Start to Exit, I started to put down some of the things I'd learned along the way in that journey to try and make it easier at the end. So anybody that's particularly in a tech business has tried to raise money on the way, through scaling, will know that there's this thing called due diligence. So an investor comes to the business, digs deep into what you're doing, looks for all the problems, and it's up to you to warrant basically that everything is as shown. And if things go wrong, you could be, as a director or a founder, liable unless you've disclosed all the issues. So the same happens at the end of the game as well. And if you can keep everything organized as you go, then it's much easier to make those disclosures and warrants as you're asked the question. So one of the things that we did in this anti-counterfeiting company that I mentioned, that I've sort of talked about briefly in the book as well, is we would have regular board meetings and we would write a board report for those meetings. What I mean by regular is I think it was every 2 months. It wasn't every month, every 2 months. But the board reports, we would write down all that we could that had happened in the business over that period, both the good and the bad. So the idea was that when an investor or eventually the acquirer came to us and said, well, let's have all the information, we actually just gave them all the board reports and said, pretty much it's all in here. So you can read for yourself all the issues and all the good things that have happened. And then, we can answer questions after that. That's an example. Yeah, but it's hard, when you're running a business, to do all that as well. It's hard.
Indeed, and there'll be people I'm sure listening, going crikey, I'm just trying to find the next customer, or the next iteration of my product. And you're telling me I've got to do all of that, but absolutely, and just going back to what you're saying about the. Thinking from the start about the exit, of course, you had a successful exit, which was a sale essentially, but that's not necessarily the only kind of exit. And I think what you're talking about, with some of the things you were saying there, is if we're building a business that could be sold, then the chances are it will be easier to run, it'll be more resilient, but it will create options along the way, which because we don't know when we're going to exit. We might plan to be bought, and that would be a nice exit, but we could get ill along the way, or something else could happen that would force that exit. So if we're kind of going, well, we'll wait to plan the exit until we think we could sell, you've got all that time in between when something else could come out of the blue and strike you down.
Yes, yeah. No, I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. So, and did you go as far then? You mentioned with the board reports. I love that idea as that kind of track record, that audit history of everything that's gone on within the business. Did you create what some people kind of call almost like a war room or a due diligence room, a digital space where you've got all of the key elements of the business that somebody might want to look at?
Yes. Yeah, exactly that. So, actually, we didn't create a separate room. We actually created the server that was running. And so this was a few years ago. So cloud-based services were in their early stages, and people had servers and so forth in the office. But it doesn't matter. The same applies. We created an architecture to our server that was organized to keep all the information in the way that it was needed. And again, I talk about this in my book because there are several elements to this. One, it helps raising finance and the eventual exit, whatever that is, as you say, but also it helps in the growth and the scaling of the business, because when you have new members of staff joining you, you want them to hit the ground running, have the information that's appropriate to them at their fingertips in the business. If all that information is on your laptop and your founder's laptop and the other couple of people you've got in your business, and it's all scattered around, whether that's business development, sales, HR, finance, all of those different bits of information. If you hire someone with one function, business development, they need all that sales and business development information, but they don't want, and indeed you shouldn't show them the HR and financial information, So actually what you should do is start a server architecture within your business, which is broken down into the kind of departments, the functions of the business. Put the information as it arrives and assimilated in those right boxes, right folders, etc. And then when someone joins the organization, they can see the right folders right from the start. Makes it a lot easier to scale. And then, because you, in amongst all of that, you will have things associated with the board and with the finance and with HR. That's your data repository that makes the due diligence that much easier as well, because you know where to look for it all. Great.
Good. So let's go back. Let's go back and think then about maybe with whichever business you prefer. But what strategically do you think? What strategic moves do you think made you successful? Did you get right?
Yeah, so the first business, the anti-counterfeiting business, this was actually a spin out from a research institute. So it was actually in Singapore. So the equivalent in the UK would be spinning out of a university with some technology and growing the business. And I think one of the things we got right with that was protecting the intellectual property and negotiating a fair agreement around that. So what happens in those sort of situations is that the intellectual property is developed and owned by the institution that you've originally worked in, the university, for example, and then you need to license that to the business as you spin off. And the same applies if you're leaving a company as a spin out, or you've got some technology that you're using or IP from somewhere else. You need this license agreement to allow it to work. And that license agreement gives you permission to develop something, but also excludes others from doing things and competing with you. So in this particular case, we negotiated an exclusive license agreement. That meant that we as the new company could take the tech that we developed in the university environment and rapidly get it working for the commercial applications. And nobody else could do that, with that same technology. And we had patent protection to give it, some extra ring fence protection in the real world. So intellectual property protection is really, really helpful for that kind of approach. And, people think, okay, maybe that's only high tech, but even in a regular business, what you've written is copyrighted. Make sure you protect it. Copyright is an automatic protection. You don't need to file for it. But make an effort to know what you've got and to look after it. And then you've got design rights and patents and trademarks that are all useful. In the case of our present business, a lot of it is software coding, and there are things you can do with that. It is effectively copyrighted, the source code, but you shouldn't be able to see that. You can patent elements of it, but in our case, it's all about working quickly and having the know-how, so protecting it through our own internal confidential information, really. So again, intellectual property is really important.
Very good. And something just referring back as well to your current business, you were hinting at is what about the positioning? Because I think both businesses sound similar in that with the counterfeiting, with the digital fingerprint, or physical sort of fingerprint that you're doing there, and with your current business, the opportunities are endless. Yeah.
Yeah, they are. And it's really hard not to get too diluted and too out of focus. I think in many ways, some of the things we did in that early anti-counterfeiting business was we were a bit like rabbits in headlights at times. It was like, wow, there's so many opportunities here. We were getting inquiries, as I say, we're in Singapore, inquiries about not fake, but sugar in Indonesia evading tariffs. We were getting inquiries about oil in Pakistan and India that was fake or tampered with. Medicines here, car parts there. There was just so much to go after. And what we needed to do was really focus and just actually look at maybe a vertical, a sector. In the end, we did quite well in the automotive sector. That was where we ended up focusing, but it took us a while to realize that. In our current business, it's been going on a while in the sense that it is around about 5 years. And that's because we've sort of meandered our way and tried out a few different things on the way. We've had a bit of luxury with the time. We weren't in any rush with this one. Both my co-founder and I did want to explore the blockchain space. I wouldn't recommend that sort of necessarily for a business approach. You really want to get revenues in quickly and build the business. But what that has enabled us to do is get a better understanding of blockchain and that technology. And right at the beginning, I mentioned non fungible tokens. So we did do some work with NFTs, and it's been really quite interesting and cutting edge. And I think we're probably one of the few companies in the UK with that capability, albeit somewhat niche and unusual. So I can explain a little bit about those NFTs if you'd like to hear what.
Yes, go ahead. Let's see how technical it gets.
Okay, so basically the NFT is this so-called non-fungible token. So I mentioned Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies associated with blockchain. If you think about a Bitcoin, it's like a dollar bill. They're all equivalent. There's lots of dollar bills in the world. And, I can exchange dollar bills, and your dollar bill is effectively the same as my dollar bill. That's called a fungible token. If you have a non-fungible token, they're all unique. So they're a bit like pieces of art. And indeed, that's what most of NFTs are. They are digital art associated with the blockchain. So replace the dollar bill with a unique piece of art and then trade in that. So people collect these NFTs because the way the blockchain works, bit like exchanging the money, you can exchange the token that's associated with the art. And so you have digital art collectors that amass and trade these non-fungible tokens, these NFTs. And this was fascinating for us because actually it works because the NFT is also a kind of a certificate. So we're back to this certification process again. And what we did actually a few years ago is we worked with Paul Farrell, an artist and a friend of my colleague Tom, who had built a portfolio of digital art, but had printed it. So he'd used computers to generate it. And we worked with him to take some of his gem-based art, so things like diamonds and sapphires and so on. We took his artwork, we ran it through some algorithms and generated lots of different versions of colors and sizes and shades. And we linked those individually onto the blockchain to create a collection of gems that people could then buy and sell as NFTs. And when we did this, early days, nobody really knew what we were doing. It was very exploratory and it didn't actually go very far. We got it working, very cursory interest. And so we just left it there and carried on with actually the certificate, the platform I've talked about. And then about a year and a half later, towards COVID time, in the middle of COVID, suddenly these things started to be sold because they were still on the marketplace. And the reason was there was interest in them all of a sudden. They'd been discovered and they were old relatively in the big scheme of things. And so they had some collector value. And so these things started to trade, generated us some revenue, and indeed generated the artists some revenue as well because of the way we have the agreement, which is part of the aim of these things is they're supposed to support the artist as well. And off the back of that, we thought, great, there's been this resurgence. We'd always talked about doing another NFT project when there was interest because of what we'd learned. And so we actually worked with another artist, Alex Lucas, who's a muralist in Bristol, again, a friend of Tom. And she generated a number of pirate characters that are based around animals. We then worked with an NFT marketing influencer who's well known in this space called Pranksy Limited. And this three-way arrangement allowed us to issue and launch a new NFT project called Picaroons, which were basically pirate characters, lots of different ones, some rarer than others, some the captain of the ship, some the crew of the ship. And we launched those, and those sold very quickly. And that's partly because the art is fantastic. Again, a real artist was involved. The marketing went very well because we used this marketing partner who was well versed in the space. And then we came along with the sort of the technology stack to make it all work. So we've had these two successful NFT projects, and they are very different to what we're doing in the day business as well with what we call Blockmark Registry, the certificates. So we've actually reached this point now where we're going to do what's called a demerge, which is where we create effectively two companies, one to focus exclusively on the NFT space, and that's effectively going to spin off or be separated from the current Blockmark Technologies, which will focus on the enterprise certification. And again, that's because, even just thinking about what's on our website, they're two very different things. It makes it very confusing for people. But, we've learned a lot doing both, and there's business opportunity in both.
Yeah, so you're essentially realizing that the target market, the value proposition, they're quite distinct, and to a point where actually it's confusing if they're together. Yeah, exactly. And we don't really want to stop either of them, I suppose, is the going back to the focus. We should focus on just one, and it was almost accidental in a way that the other one took off when it did, and we were suddenly left thinking, gosh, we've got two quite distinct opportunities here. Very good. So let's pick up on that focus then, and whether it's to do with this side of it or whether it's to go back to with the original business where you said you settled on the automotive sector. You hinted it took you a little while to come to that. What in the end was it that made you decide that the automotive sector was the place to focus? Yeah, in that particular example, it really came down to bandwidth again. We actually had quite early on a customer in the automotive sector, and we worked with them again very closely to get the technology into their production line. And as we progressed down that route, more and more of our resource was being focused into that and needed to be in order to deliver everything properly. And so over time, we simply couldn't address everything else that was being bombarded at us. So that was a saving grace, really. But also, as we focused more with the opportunity, we got to know the customer very well. And they really became almost like a partner in a way. They were very keen on developing what we were doing. They were well connected in the automotive industry as well. And they actually became champions for what we were doing and wanted to also focus on bringing what we were doing to the market that they were very familiar with. So we ended up having discussions about a joint venture with them. It got to that level. We never actually went down the joint venture route in the end. But I think that showed us at that point, hang on, we really do need to just focus on this. The opportunity in this sector alone is immense. Yeah. And having the right partner was key in tapping into that. Good. All right. Excellent. And if somebody was thinking about positioning, which markets to play in, what sort of thinking should they be going through? Yeah, it's very interesting. There's often this, the grass is always greener on the other side approach. And I think what happens is people think the opportunity is greater somewhere else because they know less about it.
I've been guilty of this as well.
Yeah.
And actually, I would say focus on what you know. So if you know a sector well, focus on it because you know the problems, and that's why you think that may not be so good. You're daunted by the problems. If you look at another sector, you don't know those problems. That's why it looks so much more opportunistic. So that's my advice, really. Stay with what you know and work with others that can help you grow that knowledge. And if you do want to diverge into another sector, get a partner that knows that sector well as well.
Right. Very good. Excellent. So let's think about, technology businesses we've got here. You mentioned the now maybe the time pressure, you didn't have the pressure so much to start earning revenue quite so quickly. So what about the original business? That sounds like that might have required a fair bit of investment to set the business up. How did you go about managing the startup?
Yeah, so certainly when you're involved in tech that's an actual thing. So software obviously is tech based, but software is much lower cost. People can develop it in their garage if they want, or their back bedroom. But when you've got things, that adds to the complexity. And indeed, with this anti-counterfeiting company, we had to raise angel finance and venture capital finance to grow the business and to cover the costs. That adds this extra dimension of complexity for sure, because all the time you spend trying to raise finance, you're not spending developing the product and getting it to a customer. So it's an added level of distraction. But nevertheless, the value again could be quite high in the end because you've got this system of products that you can sell. So it's playing off that balance of, if I invest more now, will I have a bigger opportunity in the future, and managing that. Certainly in that case, I was the CEO of that business and my colleague was the CTO, and we used to try and divide and conquer a lot. So he would spend a lot of time focusing on the technology, getting that working. I would spend a lot of time trying to encourage investors to come on board. Okay. And then the two of us were always involved in the sort of the discussions in the end, because investors want to know all the details of the management team and the founders and check that they're capable and can work to the goals that they're going to set. So it becomes very demanding on time, very much so.
So what sort of things would you advise to other people that are thinking about raising external finance?
Well, first of all, try and cost it properly, as in budget and forecast what you really need. And that's two-sided, really. One is you always need more than you think, because, first of all, the fundraising process takes longer, and you run out of money sooner. That's the first thing. But also, this is why it's such a difficult balance. If you try and raise too much money, effectively your valuation, you're raising surplus. So you're doing a disservice to your business. You're trying to take on too much money for either what you can spend or what you need. And so you don't want to do that either. And I think the only way to sort that out is potentially to forecast carefully what you're going to spend it on, come up with some estimates of, well, when are you going to make revenue or increase the revenue and so forth? And what actually is the money you're raising going to achieve in terms of milestones? And one thing you can do is break that sort of receipt of the money based on milestones, and then actually try and build into the whole agreement that if you reach milestones, the value of your business has gone up, which means that you can take on more money that is less expensive for the business. That's quite a complicated thing to kind of work out in your head, but you're basically saying, if I reach certain milestones, the share price will be higher.
Yeah. So if you ask for, as you said at the beginning, if you ask for too much money up front, you might end up giving away quite a lot of your equity for a certain amount of money. Whereas if you do it in steps, then you can manage that a bit better. So people coming in later are essentially paying more for for a less risky and a more valuable business, hopefully. Yes, indeed. Good. So what is there anything, what would, with the benefit of hindsight, what would you maybe have done differently in terms of raising the finance?
Yeah. So when we were raising finance, we were actually going for fairly small tranches. And that's partly because we were actually in Singapore, where raising tech finance back then was quite hard. I think it's probably got easier more recently, but this was 15, 20 years ago. I've lost track. But there, if I was raising money to open a hotel or some kind of entertainment venue or so on, I think it would have been easier. There was much more risk averse against investing in tech. So it was hard to raise the money. And so we did go overseas to get it. And I think with hindsight, we would probably have tried to raise more money overseas earlier on. It would have been a bit more of an effort, but I think we would have been less sort of absorbed in the money raising process. We literally went from money raised to money raised to money raised.
Yeah.
And actually it was just before the financial crisis as well. So we were incredibly lucky. But I think had we not exited when we did, the next round of raising finance, which would have been necessary, would have been really tough. And, I'm not sure what the outcome would have been.
Good. And maybe that's a good option to go into the exit itself. What can you tell us about that anybody starting to think about exiting should be? You've already mentioned a few things at the beginning of the interview.
Yeah. Well, so what was interesting was when we started that particular business, we did have the exit firmly in mind. And I think that's partly because both of us were effectively expatriates living in Singapore. So we didn't see ourselves as spending the next 20 to 30 years in a job in Singapore. So the mindset was already quite different. We saw this as, let's build the business. Also, we could see that the business could grow even more if it was acquired by a bigger company with the appetite to grow, because as we've discussed, there were lots of opportunities. So we had all of that in mind. And because we were raising venture capital finance, actually, they had it in mind, of course. When you raise money, the exit is much more talked about because the financiers need an exit in order to realize their investment gains. So we were very keen on the exit. We kind of built this all within mind, and we did get several propositions quite early on that talked about, well, are you up for sale? Why don't we acquire you? And that got us thinking more about the process, made us understand some of the things that were being asked of us, and got our house in order, which was really helpful. And then in a particular case, when the acquisition actually came along, what actually happened in this case was it was a company that was interested in our technology and wanted to collaborate with us. So it's in the public domain. The company that bought us is called Billcare Technologies, or Billcare. They're an Indian listed company in the pharmaceutical packaging space. And they had looked at our tech and said, this looks really interesting to protect pharmaceuticals against counterfeiting. And we'd like to work with putting your tech onto our packages. And I think what happened is, as they worked with us, they realized that, one, we were quite small and vulnerable. They were going to invest time and effort in bringing our system into a really high volume application. I mean, blister packs for medicines produced in the billions. So in order for them to be sure that their investment, was realized and that we didn't just go under or something change, the conversation started to turn around to, well, actually, what about an acquisition? Because then we can bring all the tech in-house and we can expand it more quickly, and all of these sort of discussions. So that was fortuitous, and that's how it progressed, really. Once that conversation started, we started down that route, and eventually they did acquire us. And
was it a complete outright sale? You got all the cash and you just disappeared off and did something else, or did you have an earn-out in there? How was all of that structured?
Yeah, so as with most of these sort of acquisitions, there's an earn-out, and this is particularly the case with technology businesses because there's a lot of know-how in the team and in the founding team. So in our case, my colleague and I, we were the original inventors of the tech. We had written the patents and so forth. So they weren't just going to buy the company and set us free that we knew that, and so actually, without getting into the specific details, it becomes a negotiation, and it's important, I think, to understand that when you are acquired, you are going to be working in a very different environment to that which you used to. You're no longer running the frenetic startup or scale up, and you're no longer the boss, even though that's not often the case anyway, because you have investors and other shareholders. But it's, you're suddenly subsumed into a much larger corporation, which has its own way of doing things. And it's often a lot bigger. So you have to bear that in mind. And when you're negotiating, you need to think, how comfortable am I going to be working in this, and for how long? And the negotiation is all about, what is the tie-in? What are the milestones? How quickly do I get the money, and so forth? And that adds quite a lot of complexity. There are all kinds of considerations there based on, what happens if things don't go well? What happens if the acquirers, mess things up because you're no longer in control anyway? And there are some very high-profile cases of where this has happened, where people have been acquired and the businesses have not worked out. So, you definitely need help and assistance with that process. Lawyers can help. They're obviously relatively expensive, but talk to others that have done it, know some of the pitfalls, and be bold. People want to acquire you. It's a bit like buying and selling a house. They want to buy you. So, be strong and negotiate in that situation, and reach an agreement.
And was there anything you might have done different, again, with hindsight, in that sale process?
I think we would have probably tried to negotiate a bit stronger in terms of the length of time we were working afterwards. So we were working for a while after that. It was an interesting time, for sure. We had a bigger team, more resources. The product actually developed a lot during that period, but it was more difficult navigating in that multinational company structure, for sure. So I think, a shorter workout time would have been better, because you can always work longer if it's going well.
Yes.
For both sides, they're not going to sack you, and you can probably stay. But
Okay. Brilliant. Good. Well, I think it's been absolutely fascinating. So just starting to bring it home a little bit in terms of the Blockmark Technologies. What does the future hold? What is, if we're talking in 5 years' time, what does good look like for you?
Yeah, so our focus now is very much on the scale-up side. So what we're trying to do is get more customers on board issuing certificates. And what's really interesting about it is the way the platform's set up is the more certificates that are issued, the more people receive certificates on the platform. And hopefully some of them say, I issue certificates as well. Why don't I use this platform to do this? So we're hoping for a bit of a viral effect there.
Yeah.
And I think we're getting to the point now we can already sense some of that is happening. So I am getting inquiries from companies that have received certificates that are saying, I'm interested in issuing. What do I have to do? And the challenge for us is to make that as slick as possible, so it doesn't involve talking to me, but it's completely obvious on the platform what to do, and they should be able to get on and do it. So we're working on some of that. And I think, where we want to get to is be a recognized platform in the UK where people are managing their certificates both personally and in their business. So, I wouldn't say a household name, but maybe a business hold name, something like that. And then, of course, exit eventually, in the sense that I think it will be a valuable business for other companies in the space, not of issuing certificates, but interacting with businesses, because we're effectively building a database of accredited businesses that have received certificates for a whole range of things, which tends to mean they're good. And there will be other businesses out there that could really use that to augment what they're doing in a broader sense with their other enterprise tools. So I think that's where we hope. And so, 5-year time frame for that.
Excellent. Fantastic. So you're up for a bit of a quick fire round? Couple of questions? Great. Yeah. So kind of asked a bit of this, but if you could go back to your younger self, what advice would you give yourself?
I So I would say I would not worry quite so much about the future in terms of, what career am I going to do? What's it going to be like? Just got to run with it a bit more and go with the flow.
Brilliant. Great stuff. Any books or podcasts or other resources that you found particularly useful? Obviously, we've got your own Startup to Exit, but any others?
Yeah, I think I've been reading a number of innovation books. Okay. I run a Malvern Festival of Innovation, and so I've been very interested in tech innovation for a while. Off the top of my head, ones that are good. There's Non-Bullshit Innovation. That's really fascinating. Nice. That looks at how real businesses have used innovation and creative approaches to succeed. I'll recommend that one.
Excellent. How about apps, for example? Any particular bits of software or apps that you live by?
Well, we're using Discord a fair amount, actually, which is a server chat channel. It's used by the younger generation for their gaming, but actually we use it to do a lot of communication within the business. With the coders, which are of a younger generation. And the other thing is Atlassian's Jira, which is a kind of project planning board. We use that to prioritize all our software development stuff.
Excellent. Very good. Who's had the most influence on you, do you think? Not necessarily as a business leader, but generally, who's had the most influence?
Well, I think when I was young, I was intrigued by Clive Sinclair and the ZX Spectrum and so on. Yeah. And I had a ZX Spectrum when I was young. I was into computing and so forth. And I was fascinated by how he had managed to bring this low-cost computer to the market. And then, of course, Alan Sugar kind of succeeded with him with his Amstrad and, is very visible on The Apprentice. So, yeah, those two, I think, have always fascinated me. Yeah.
Excellent. Good. And I always ask this one around, what's your most successful marketing or lead generation tactic? What do you find works for you?
Yeah, I think writing an article as a thought leader for some kind of journal works well. So a lot of people pay for advertising. And I think that trade journals and newspapers are always craving articles and news. And if you're very careful with how you word what you're doing, you can actually get free copy and they want it. And it's a really good way of being seen as an industry leader.
Perfect. Brilliant. Been absolutely fascinating talking to you, Adrian. Thank you very much for your time today on ScaleUp Radio. If people would like to get hold of you, find out more about Blockmark Technologies, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, best way, I have a website, adrianburden.net. So that kind of summarizes the book, various things I'm working on, including Blockmark Technologies, and also links to my social media, so LinkedIn, Twitter, etc.
Fantastic. Very good. Adrian, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Kevin. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed that discussion, and if you're building and scaling your own business, you might well be interested in our book, The Entrepreneurial Scale-Up System. And it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's a practical handbook around scaling a business in a structured way. And you can order a copy on all your favorite online retailers, including an audio version, or you can find it and other supporting resources on our website, www.esusgroup.co.uk. That's esusgroup.co.uk, which is esusgroup.co.uk.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.